Good evening, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Welcome to our KCLS program in partnership with Newcastle Historical Society. We are welcoming Pacific Northwest Railroad Archive tonight, in particular, Gary Tarbox. He's going to be our presenter this evening. We wanted to let you into the room a little early, a few minutes early, just as folks are settling in. I just wanted to give you a welcome. My name is Vicki. I am a librarian for King County Library System. I work specifically at our Newcastle branch. KCLS is slowly beginning to open up our libraries to limited in-person use. I know perhaps many of you are familiar with our curbside pickup that we've been offering during the pandemic, the bulk of the pandemic. You've been able to place holds and come to your closest library and pick up your holds at curbside. It's slowly reopening. The closest branch in the Newcastle area is our Lake Hills Library. But if you are anywhere in King County and curious what your closest in-person open branch is, you can just go to kcls.org, and we've got some great links there that will get you all the information that you need. All right, we are at the top of the hour, so I want to be mindful of your time. So I would like to get underway. Like I mentioned, my name is Vicki, a librarian for King County Library System at our Newcastle branch. And that is where I had the good fortune to meet Russ Segner, who is president of the Newcastle Historical Society. I have done a lot of fantastic programs with Russ and his crew over this past year in particular online. Learning about Newcastle history, the robust history around Newcastle. It was bigger than Seattle at one point in history, as coal was king over there, and Newcastle had a lot of coal. So I had the good fortune to meet Russ, and Russ actually was the gentleman that introduced me to this Pacific Northwest Railroad Archive and Gary. And so I have a lot of appreciation for Russ for the introduction and for bringing Gary here tonight to talk about uncovering community stories from railroad history. I'm going to turn it over to Russ now, who's going to introduce Gary. Russ?
Hi, thank you, Vicki. That's way too big an introduction for my part. It's our pleasure as Newcastle Historical Society to bring, through the auspices of the King County Library District, a number of programs. And I felt it was really interesting and important to have a better understanding amongst certainly our historical society membership, as well as a lot of the folks that I'm familiar with in the region who are interested in railway history, et cetera, to get a better understanding of what Gary Tarbox and the archives are all about. Gary's a 41-year career high technology person. Retired from Microsoft in 2004. And during all those years, he had a significant interest in the Northern Pacific Railroad and was involved in the formation of the Northern Pacific Railway Historical Association. He edited the Main Streeter, which is their quarterly magazine. After he retired from Microsoft, he had time for thinking hard about doing something more significant than talking about an archive. So he helped create this one. So he gathered together the founders, drafted the archive plan, raised the initial funding. And so now we've had 11 years of history with his work, and we're going to learn a lot more about it here tonight. So Gary, it's my pleasure to introduce you to my friends and a lot of people around the region.
Well, thank you, Russ and Vicki. I really appreciate the King County Library System, which serves Burien, where we're located. They've been good partners in the Burien area. I wanted just to review kind of what we've really done here at the archive. You know, clearly, why did we start the Railroad Archive in the Seattle area? Well, railroads established most of the communities in the Western United States, as well as the Pacific Northwest region. if your town wasn't on a railroad, you couldn't get your products to meaningful markets. And therefore, for example, you couldn't really grow wheat. In fact, they didn't grow wheat in Washington until the railroads came in, because if you grew wheat, you could sell it to your local baker and a few housewives, but that was about all you had for a market without a railroad. So fundamentally, they were kind of built into the structure of the Pacific Northwest, the area that we live in. At the same time, railroads documented everything about their lines, and also some of the surrounding areas, and which provides kind of a snapshot of the region all the way from 1880 to the present. Many knew that important railroad history would disappear if these railroad records were not preserved. And special facilities would also be needed to care for the material and make it accessible to everyone. During the 1970s, during 1970, I should say, the Burlington Northern merger essentially collapsed the Great Northern, the Northern Pacific, the SP&S, and the Burlington Railroad, along with the Pacific Coast Railroad, which ran on the east side of Lake Washington, into the Burlington Northern Company. And at that time, a lot of predecessor items were given to regular archives. Most notable here in Seattle was the special collections at the University of Washington received some, and also Mohi. But the majority of the corporate records ended up back in St. Paul at the Minnesota Historical Society. But then it moved to Seattle and was here for about 8 years, headquartered in Seattle. And when they decided to move to Fort Worth, they tended to throw out a whole bunch more of the predecessor. In fact, it was some of the best predecessor stuff. And at that point, word went out to the people in the rail fan community and the rail history community. People rented trucks, went down to King Street Station, and took as much stuff as they could possibly handle. And that ended up in lockers. It ended up in basements, barns, and all sorts of things for a while. Now, those rescuers are all in their 70s to 90s. And this is back 10 years ago. We were saying that we really needed to get something going if we were going to preserve this stuff, or it will all end up in the landfill. Because the kids of these people who actually rescued the stuff will never understand the value of it in the context of being just in a storage area. So we agreed at the time that we really needed to get the archive going in 2009. And we established our mission of PNRA was to provide a facility where railroad operating material can be preserved, scanned, cataloged, and made accessible on the internet. We put together the plan and found a building and signed up 5 historical organizations, which we'll talk about in a minute, that would pool their resources to create the world-class railroad archive that we had envisioned. After a year of looking, we found a building, and I sent out an email to about 100 people who had expressed interest in our venture. And in 7 days, we had $27,000 in checks on the table. And I thought, this might work. And as it turns out, we really were able to pull in about $160,000 to go ahead and purchase the building and get PNRA going. We realized that if we didn't own the building, you can't really have an archive. um, because you can't be dependent upon someone who can pull your contract at any time. So we really need to own it. So we are basically, yeah, so the groups that we have in the archive now is the Boeing Model Railroad Club, which have about 1,500 feet of space for their layout. We have the Cascade Rail Foundation, which preserved the history of the Milwaukee Road in Washington State. We have the Great Northern Railway Historical Society, which of course has around 2,700 members. We have the Northern Pacific group that has about 1,800 members, and the SP&S group, which is about a 300 member organization that preserve their material at the archive. So let's take an example of some of the things that we can do. Community research. Railroad history has a lot of community history in it. If you like a then and now research, this is the place to start. One day I received a call from the city of Kent asking if we had any information on O'Brien. And I said, I have no idea, because I've never heard of O'Brien. So I started doing a little research from our records and from other available records. I found out that the O'Brien farm was the place that Irish immigrants made their first stop when they arrived in King County in the mid 1800s. This is before the railroads arrived. And the Northern Pacific, when it built in 1884, cut across the farm so that it made it it made a reason for them to put a depot in for O'Brien. By the way, O'Brien's about 2 miles north of Kent. It had that depot, and it also had a track maintenance crew based in O'Brien. The O'Brien now is an industrial commercial area, but it still appears on some maps, mainly the older ones. The types of material that we started to look for were maps. We wanted to look for authorizations for expenditures, which, let me explain what that is. That is essentially project authorization by the railroad. In this case, it was the Northern Pacific Railway. And the in these AFE files, which end up being fairly thick usually, they put all the correspondence, all of the notes, and everything that kind of had to do with the project. This gives us an incredible amount of history in there, because there's handwritten letters back and forth between various parties, whether it be a contractor or thing. One of the more interesting things is when one community starts asking for a better depot, and they say, these guys down the track, they've got a full brick depot, and we're sitting here with this crummy wooden thing that's about ready to fall down. It's just really fun to see the kinds of dialogue that's going on, and also the justification of what the project was about. We also would look at joint facility ledgers, since it's on the main line. Again, joint facility things were put out to actually document the contractual obligations of the railroad to other railroads that were using the same line. And in this case, we had the Great Northern and also the Union Pacific were using it, and both of them had different arrangements for the use of the line, so that they had different obligations. And also we have photos at the archive of about 250,000 images, and so we'd want to check those to see if there were any images operation. One of the things that we found immediately was we had street maps, and we have title plats, and we have station plats. Title plats being dealing with the ownership of the land, and station plats dealing mainly with the surrounding buildings and facilities and dimensions of all things that happen to be close to the depot. So here's the first street map of things showing O'Brien. Now, O'Brien, as it turns out in today's parlance, is at 212th and the railroad, the Burlington Northern Railroad tracks. As you can see, it crosses the line where it's crossing the 212th Street. O'Brien was just south of 212th at that point. Also, you can note that if you go just a little bit to the west of the O'Brien, you'll see where the north-south line for the Milwaukee and UP is going through the same area. So the next thing is really from our title plats. Now this deals with ownership of and an exact location of all the facilities. You'll notice all these the lines up here with the numbers in front of them and an identified structure. Now, the way the railroad locates things is it's basically longitudinal along the line, and the number is so many lines from a head block plus feet to actually locate where you're at. What you have down here is O'Brien is essentially right in this area here, right around on the west side of the right of way, and this is where the depot and the couple outbuildings were. The bunkhouse and tool house are right in this area. So the next thing we do is we look at AFEs. And so we went to our AFE database, and we find that there are 9 AFEs dealing with O'Brien, and they go from 1909 to 1916, and just decided to use the 1913 tool house, which the area did not have a tool house at that time. And so the section crews were asking for the tool house, and they had all sorts of interesting things about it. Now, this is what an AFE, the top paper of an AFE. It's by the way an accounting. This is just about numbers and a few words, but so it's not terribly interesting. But when you want to get down into the real interesting thing, you get, unfortunately, I'm going to be kind of the thing is going right across the letter. But here, the guy says this section has never had a tool house, and we've experienced theft of our tools from time to time. And that was their justification for building a new tool house in 1913. So also in the AFE is this map, and that's one of the beauties of most of the AFEs. They have a map to show you kind of where everything's located. What's interesting, this is the depot is right here. It's not a very big building, but what you really see, the big area here is more the platform. It's interesting that this is a star house, and this particular thing to the north, by the way, of the depot is called a saloon, which they have written out on it. They give you that. Then there's a number of dwellings and various things, but these 3 buildings over here are called pigeon lofts. back in the days when people used pigeons or kept pigeons, but they're quite a bit of space for pigeon lofts. There's also a thing right here called a chicken loft, which I presume is chicken house, but it's right on the right of way of the railroad. So this map is kind of really useful, and that's one of the things about AFEs. It's fun is to look at these maps and see kind of what they're doing. Oh, by the way, the little black area down here is where the tool house is. I kind of jumped over that, and next to it is the bunkhouse where the section crews work. So the next thing is really our joint facilities documents. Now, as I mentioned to you before, this is a contractual basis, but one of the beauties is they have these absolutely pristine photos that they shoot with a big format camera. Now he is standing on a step ladder. The guy who shot these, name was James Fisher. This was done in 1928. In fact, it was May 14th of 1928. James Fisher is standing on a step ladder to get a little height. We have the depot is over here, O'Brien Depot. The storehouse is behind it. The saloon is actually not, you can't see it. And then there's another building here that didn't appear on that drawing, and this was called a food warehouse, whatever that meant in 1928. But this is 93 years ago. And look at that open space. The other interesting thing is you can tell it's a main line for the fact that it has all the sections on the telephone poles, because that's the way, since you didn't have radios in these days, everything had to be by wire. And so they connected all of the stations and all of their signals and their functionality through telephone line or telephone pole and lines on those telephone poles. One other little item, there's a woman standing right here looking at the cameraman, which I find is very neat. So this is a very interesting item. All the key areas in the photo are marked. There's you see the D is on the depot, and you'll see over here when they mark it, excuse me, that's the B. I misread that. Is the depot is B. The D is actually the bridge that he's standing on, and that's how we knew that this was a food warehouse, because he has a C on that. So looking at the same spot today, it's fairly industrial and business parky. And in fact, there's 7 lanes of road here. That other road on the other, on this thing is 16 feet wide. This road is 105 feet wide, which would put the depot right in the middle of the eastbound lanes of the street. Looking the other way, which we didn't look at on the other one, but this shows you, this is all an industrial park. All the lots are the same. With the dimensions of the lots appear to be exactly the same as they were when they were owned by individuals, but now they're owned by companies, and their various supply and in industrial uses. So let's review for a minute then. Now that you've seen a little bit of the research material, let's review the types of material that we have at the archive. Again, I mentioned we had about 250,000 images. Many of them are now online for specific collections, and those that aren't are available for researchers. We have the station plats, which was with the blue document. We have a number of those broken out in collections. Certainly the AFEs authorization for expenditures. You have the valuation records from the valuation department, which really is record of the investment in the railroad. See, back when they created the Interstate Commerce Commission, they did it mainly because the railroads were charging exorbitant rates, and Congress basically passed a law that said, "Thou shalt not increase their rates beyond usually around 5 to 6% of the actual investment they made in the railroads," which meant that the railroads then had to go forth and do a very detailed accounting of all of the investment that they'd made in their plant. And that wasn't just the track, that was every time they bought another piece of paper. It got down to the very small detail, which is very useful. In retrospect, we now have these valuation records that come from different eras, and they will talk about the kinds of things they bought, how big they were, what, all the dimension stuff. It's quite amazing. It's one of the things that makes the whole railroad history much more accessible, because it was documented by the railroads. We also have track profiles, really, which detail the curves, the grades, the signals, the stations, and that sort of thing that have to do with the train. These are for the operating engineers who are piloting the trains, so that they have something to know where these are. Now, of course, after you've run them a few times, you begin to understand it, but they do document it for the training purposes, but also for the maintenance crews, and to know exactly what the dimensions of things are. Employee timetables really are, when you break them all the way down, they're the rules of superiority of trains. Which trains go into a siding so that the other train can pass. The rules of that are fairly complicated, but they are spelled out. They're spelled out in rule books, but the timetable really is the local conditions of when trains are running, and which ones have the superiority. Special instructions really are operating rules for trains in a particular division and subdivision of the railroad. So they're more detailed breakdown of what's happening. Equipment assignments is really where equipments were used, and then the equipment diagrams show the dimensions, builder dates of equipment, which again are very useful for modeling and doing the history of particular pieces of equipment. We have dispatchers' train sheets. Now, this is essentially a kind of a cheat sheet where the dispatchers keep track of what's happening on a particular piece of the railroad for a 24-hour period. We have about 18,000 of these, probably the most accumulated anywhere on the West Coast for sure. This is, if you're doing research on a particular piece of track, this is a very important thing to look at, to see if we've got information about how the trains ran. Usually the train sheets are compiled in a 1-month period. So you got 30 days use of track usage over a period. Then yard diagrams obviously show which tracks and services. The property change records are related to the title plats and really show the chain of ownership of land, both that is owned by the railroad and also that is next to the railroad that they might need to pick up at some point. Annual reports for the railroads really show the railroad performance and the conditions of the railroad for each given year. Manufacturer catalogs, again, this is a a way of looking at standardized equipment that may be used all over the railroad. And if you need to know that kind of research, these are very invaluable to get both a picture and some explanation of the standard equipment. We have railroad history books. We have a reference library of about 2,500 books. Again, it's all books that relate to the Pacific Northwest railroads and in any support books for them. Geographical maps gives us a little bit better sense of the environment that the railroad runs through. City guides, kind of the same, only from an urban perspective. And then we have newspaper articles, really give you a local history of what's happening in the railroad stories. And then finally, we have firsthand accounts, and these are both recorded or written down accounts of what was happening at a particular time. So there's 19 items that we've identified that we have at the archive. I'm not saying we have everything, but we have a lot of items. So if you're doing research on a particular subject, this is the kinds of things that you'd be looking at and looking for. So it seemed like everybody had a relative that worked for the railroad at one time. And the reason for this has a really interesting history. You know, the first steam railroad actually ran in 1825 between Liverpool and Manchester in England. But the interesting thing was that the railroads immediately changed a lot of things about how we perceived space and time, and it changed the way we think about how our lives. Prior to the railroads, the average person never moved beyond 20 miles from where they were born, and they tended to be pretty rooted in the land. Suddenly you could get on a vehicle and go at the blinding speed of 30 miles an hour for just about as long as you wanted to go, and travel great distances. It was interesting that the railroads, within a few years of being established in England, they suddenly people started talking about how many minutes you were from something rather than how far you were. So we kind of exchanged time for space. And also an interesting thing is when the railroads first arrived in London, it was about 2 years before people started moving down the railroad tracks and commuting back into the city in the mornings. It only took a couple of years for people to figure out that they could live in a more pastoral setting. In 1900, about 50% of the skilled labor in the United States worked for the railroads, which was really our high-tech era of the time. Most people in North America had a railroader, a grandfather, or other relative in the railroad. And we are in an age of genealogy, wanting to know more about our roots. And where do you start the research? Well, the first thing to do is get to know where and when the person you want to look up lived, what their job on the railroad was, and which railroad they worked for, and what years did they work. We get calls. I mean, we must get calls or emails about 10 a month from people asking questions about, well, I had a grandfather and he worked for the railroad. Can you tell me about him? Well, no. You got to give us a few facts before we can possibly give you much information. Couple key sources, if you're looking for Great Northern or Northern Pacific things, it's the Minnesota Historical Society has all the corporate records of those two railroads. And in there are personnel records. We do not have any real personnel records other than assignments, like if you're a telegraph operator and you moved your job from one depot to another, we would often have a card for the Northern Pacific Railroad and the Tacoma Division. But that's about the limit. The corporate records actually show a much broader, so you have to kind of look at that. The Milwaukee Public Library has the Milwaukee Roads records. Ancestor.com has recently picked up the Union Pacific records and also for many other railroads. So there's a place that you can go to start getting some information. Another real important source is the Railroad Retirement Board, which was started in 1936. It was part of the New Deal. If you probably know, but railroad retirement is akin to Social Security, and it runs through its own boards and its own infrastructure, and they keep very accurate records. So if you're looking for somebody who was working for the railroad after 1936, you can get very good information from them. Certainly the LDS Church in Salt Lake has a lot of records on people and have some connection to the railroad records. And then there's of course the census records at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. All of the National Archives are online, as well as certainly the Minnesota Historical Society. You can ask questions online and get a pretty decent response. In addition, another thing though that we have that helps some of the railroad genealogy is the NP has developed an all trades database of about 40,000 records of NP employee seniority lists. In other words, it was when they hired on and where they hired on and what was the job that they got their hiring date, which is because it was highly unionized, seniority was a very important factor in the railroads. This database is searchable by name, job title, railroad division, and seniority date. It's a place to confirm employee jobs and start dates before you proceed to other sources. The database doesn't include all employees from the 1870s to 1970, but it's a good start, and it is growing each month. I pulled a set of, now this is part of the database. What I did is I filtered it for the last name of Fredrickson, and I got 19 names from all over the NP, and you can see here last name, first name, middle initial, division in which they worked. Now this is the division that they were working at their start date, or when they were, excuse me, not the start date, at the date that this particular piece of information was recorded, and then the city and state that they were in, plus the job title, the seniority date, and then some notes that deal mostly with where the information came from. So we've got some lineage back to the original data. So we do offer this to anybody. It's online on the Northern Pacific site, and it's open to anybody who wants to do some research. So let's talk about prototypical modeling. Many railroad modelers are interested in following prototypical conventions, which require research. So my good friend Kent Sullivan was looking at the Terrence Wall photos. This is a shot taken in Bellingham at the Freight House in 1952. And there, down in the way back in the distance, there's a building. And the question was, what is that building? So we pan in, and lo and behold, it's a track scale house. And you notice that this is a pretty steep grade right here, but right in front of the scale house is level with, it's been leveled out. And so we said, we need to know more about this. So again, we hit the AFE database, and we looked for Bellingham and then the subject scale. And this, of course, is on the Tacoma Division's 15th sub. We find that we actually have 5 different AFEs in there. One of them, the first one, actually is when they first put in a scale house in Bellingham in 1907. And then we ultimately made some other changes, such as the track inspector said that the beam was not accurate enough, and that they needed to make some adjustments to the scale mechanism. And then, oh, by the way, you've got this scale sitting out in the rain. It can't keep things without, unless you put it in a house. So they put a house around it in 1913. Then they had to replace the timber foundation under the scale in 1914, and they had to do it in concrete to keep it allow it to get back into adjustment. And then finally, which we can't see under this thing, it's 1945, we generated a brand new scale house. We moved it across the tracks and build a new pit and do it. So from these AFEs, we see the maps, and this is kind of interesting to see the original. Get off the hand, Holly. The original layout. This is where the first scale house was. It's right across from the passenger depot, but notice that there's no scale house there. It's just the pit and the weighing station, and they have to put a kind of gauntlet track so that the car can go over and not be on the scale, or you can switch it and put it on the scale. So this is the 1913 when they make the conversion to put the little scale house in, and you'll notice that the track has kind of changed a bit, but it's pretty much the same as it was on the first drawing. Then in 1945, here's the drawing that it happens. Now at this point, passenger service had stopped on the railroad, and what was the passenger depot is now called a warehouse. In quotes, it says Old Depot. And they put the scale on essentially where the main track to the Old Depot was. Here's the little house. They dug a new pit, but they brought all of the original balance scale across, but they put in brand new tracks and new support beams for it. So they really beefed it up. As you all know, coal was a big deal in Bellingham. It's interesting to note that they started taking coal out of Bellingham in 1854, and they didn't get a track scale on the railroad until 1907. But now they've beefed it up because things are a lot more sophisticated now. Now, in addition, and I'm afraid we're not going to see this very clearly, but there's a whole issue here. They show that they did indeed level the track right in front of at the scale house. They put the scales on a level track, but they had to regrade the entire track to get it to be able to flow a car through there without a lot of humping. So now we look at the standard plan for the rail house. Now, NP and all railroads pretty much go to standard plans so that they don't. They have a lot of their features then are identical to each other. This cuts down on maintenance and also cuts down on initial construction costs. So here's the plan for, it's a fairly narrow little house. You can see, God, hit the button. You can see the balance beam scale right in front, door in, the various roof. This is a roof hatch, and windows in the back and windows in the side. So you can see the movement of the trains getting on the scales. Notice that there's a sign up here that says don't put the let the locomotive run on the scale, because that would overload it. And then they've got the sign up here on the front of the Northern Pacific Scale House. In other words, it's pretty detailed plan. So this is the kit that the modeling committee at the NP modeling committee sent the standard plan out to a laser cutter, and was able to come up with this kit. This is you'll see the balance scale here, the signs that talking about. And then on the back wall, a nice little feature is they've actually got a miniature calendar of the correct date for, and you can basically get any calendar date you want to put on your back wall of your scale house if you want to be really precise. So anyway, this is not necessarily a promotion to sell scale houses. It's just to show you that the lineage of this comes from the kind of research that we did at the archive. And here's Greg Messier's installation of his scale house with the platform, and you notice the gauntlet tracks here that you switch, and you can put the car on the scale, or you can run cars through here without being on the scale. In addition, Jim Clowers has his installation of the similar gauntlet track in his on his layout. So that is a modeling example of the use of the archive. So an obvious question is, how does this archive operate? And it's a legitimate question. As I mentioned before, we had purchased the 7,500 square foot 3-story building in 2010. We own and operate the building for both the rail history organizations and the public. We're recognized as a 501c3 nonprofit at both Washington and federally by the IRS. The accessions to our collection currently stand at 682 collections from 375 donors. These collections range from one book to one collection that arrived in a 48-foot moving van that was absolutely packed. And amazing. That was the Ainsworth collection that arrived in 2013. We currently have, or I should say in 2019, we had 54 volunteers working at the archive. That's not including the people who also work on the Boeing layout. This is just active workers at the archive. Many of the volunteers now work at home, but the crews also work at the archive on Tuesdays and Saturdays. Basically, the volunteers inventory donations, scan, catalog material in preparation for putting it up on the internet. We have 5 workstations each of them with scanners. This is how it looked back when we were able to have without social distancing pre-pandemic. This is what our main workroom looks like, and this was a Tuesday, and it wasn't a particularly busy Tuesday. It just had quite a crew that were working in the room at the time. Our preservation of the materials is really on our lower floor. We use mobile shelving, which is of course on tracks so that it can be moved, and where you can put an aisle where you need an aisle. We basically have 2,500 square feet devoted to our preservation of the material. And that is now fully using mobile shelving to maximize the space. These particular shelving units here are 39 feet long, 32 inches wide, 88 inches high, and hold 462 banker's boxes on both sides of the item. This is what the whole bottom floor looks like. The shelving that's in yellow was added in 2019. It was our last official thing that we had to do with the archive, is to fill in the shelving that we could still handle, still had space for. This is the receiving room where we bring in new collections for sorting and determining what's really relevant to the archive. We purchased the West Bay shelving in 2012, which really helped us get going, and having places to put things is a pretty important thing in an archive. The Mid Bay and the East Bay are units that we got in 2016 and are really very useful, have filled in that space. We have a small set that was donated to us here where we have the reference library with its 2,500 volumes. And then we have another set up here that was also donated to us that is lockable, and that's where we put all the negatives and items that we want to protect from being shuffled, if you will, because of the putting them all in order. Also, just as a point, we have a whole set of storage cabinets back behind here, because these were a used set of shelving that were 20 feet. We could have used 24 feet, but we had all these cabinets from the Ainsworth collection that we put against the wall, and it really used up the space perfectly. Then this is what one of the big shelving looked like. This is 231 boxes on this side of the shelving, and you can see kind of how they're stacked as tightly as we can make it. So the 5 RHOs, or the 5 real history organizations, each pay monthly fees. We ship orders for the NPRHA and GNRHS online stores that come out of the archive. This is another revenue source. We have 143 individual contributors that make contributions every year, and that provides about 35% of our revenue. And the revenues have covered all of our operating expenses since we started. We received around 660, probably closer to 720 now, of grants. to modify the facility, add equipment, and pay down the mortgage. We finished all the building improvements at the end of 2019. We maintain, in addition, we maintain 5 rail history organizations websites on our servers at a commercial hosting center in South Seattle. And those websites have an average of 18,000 plus visits per year. We just recently replaced and upgraded our server, and now things are a lot snappier because it's a really powerful server for which Microsoft donated some very useful parts to make it happen. This is a website for the PNRA. Now, the way we do it is that any item that relates to the Great Northern, the Northern Pacific, the Milwaukee Road, or the SP&S group, they have their own websites, but things that come in that don't relate to them go on the PNRA site. For example, our fairly extensive Union Pacific and Southern Pacific collections are more on the PNRA site. Certainly the Pacific Coast Railroad collection, which is pretty thorough, also is accessible here. We have things like photo files and photo records, and those are all searchable on the site. The joint site, which is basically incorporates a Great Northern Pacific joint site, and this is to bring our partner archive in from St. Paul. They do not have the capability of being online, so we have essentially put them online through our servers, but we did it through a joint site arrangement because that's the way they're organized, as more or less a joint operation. The NP site uses a little different arrangement. Rather than the left-hand menu for selecting items, we have tiles here to allow you to start. So if you want to see equipment, you hit there, and then you go drill down into the collections pretty quickly to what it is you're looking for. In addition, the company store is based off of here, and also all of the information about the railroad is there. The SP&S research group has their own SP&S club, has a link off to our servers for the research material that we're putting on there. And here they have a complete set of all of the documents that SP&S documents that they have cataloged, which is very extensive. The beauty of the SP&S is a small enough railroad that a lot of the material was saved when the merger came, and actually is both in our archive and also the archive at the Union Station in Portland. We have part of their, the Portland, we've put their catalog on the portions of their catalog that they've developed. We put it up on our site so that they can have some internet access. And then finally, we have the Cascade Rail Foundation, which does the Milwaukee, and it's a similar thing, although they've got a really nice set of items that they put up available on the web and in a searchable modality. So who else do we serve? Well, we really provide information to the historical societies and museums, government agencies, consulting engineering firms, because there's a federal requirement for any historic building that they have to do a full workup on the history of a structure before things are modified. We have historians who often are writing commercial histories for publication. Certainly educators who really are looking for ways to present local history in a different light. Then there's also, of course, a lot of individual interest in railroad prototypical modeling. It's a big factor. People looking at regional history. They're looking at genealogy, and also in the authors who are writing books. We get a lot of emails saying, how much would it cost to ride from Baltimore to Spokane? And interestingly enough, we can actually answer that question, but it takes a little while to get it because of the multiple railroads that are done. So we tend to help authors make sure that they get times of days, costs of travel, and some of the conditions that are documented in the anyway, so that they can be authentic in their publication. And then finally, this is the front side of our building on 153rd. We have been here for 11 years now, and things are going strong. In fact, the funny thing about the pandemic was we went remote, but then we said, remote means that we could go to Chicago. So we got 2 guys in Chicago working with us. We got a guy in Florida and a couple in California, and we're going to be expanding because the beauty is we can get people, well, for the example, the guy in Florida was the last chief engineer for the Northern Pacific, and he has great knowledge on how the railroad selected their right-of-ways and things. And so he's been helping us on filling in some of the spaces there. So we can go out to the hinterlands and find people who can really help us. So that concludes my portion of the evening. I would be very happy to answer questions if you have some.
I do have a few for you, Gary. First off, I'd like to say what a value this archive is. And I am so impressed that so many people are vested and passionate and interested in collecting and keeping and documenting this information for future generations. It's really heartening. I'm really impressed with the archive and the growth that you've managed to network together and provide to such a varied community too. As you went through your slides, you're serving a bunch of different interests, and it's just phenomenal.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true.
I do have some specific archive related questions, and then I have a few kind of more genealogical stuff.
Sure.
So one would be, what happens when you run out of space at the archive?
You know, that's an interesting question. One of the things that we have not been real passionate about initially was sorting through the boxes. As I mentioned earlier, we are Pacific Northwest related, and that means it's Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, BC, and Alaska is really our main focus area. And we've got some things from California, some things from Texas and West Virginia and things like that in the collections. Now we've rooted out a lot of it. Now we don't throw that stuff away. What we do is we pass that on to an institution that really covers those areas. We have fairly active trading with various ones. But to answer your real question, I mean, one of the ways we do it is by thinning the collection that we are going to keep and being very rigorous about that. And that's one of our key things. We probably have about, I would say we're around 40% to 45% of the spaces used up, even though we've got a lot of shelving covered with stuff. It needs to be sorted more. We need to clean up the sorting. But what do? well, maybe we got to buy a building. There's happens to be at some point, or maybe we bring in some containers and fill up our backyard with containers. I don't know. This is it's a thing we joke about, but at some point we will have to attack it and come up with a real plan.
It's a work in progress. I just wanted to mention, I posted in chat an upcoming program. I know people are kind of filtering out, going to dinner and hopping on other calls. There's a MOHI program on May 19th. Some of you may be interested in how railroads brought a checkerboard landscape to the Pacific Northwest. So I just posted the link to register for that, just in case you're interested. The next archive related question is, after an archive item is scanned, does the original ever get discarded, or is it always kept?
The rule right now is we keep it. That is definitely an area where we could resolve some space issues. A lot of the stuff, for example, the AFE files, a lot of that is newsprint, and some of it's getting to be like 130 years old or more. And so the issue is, how long is this going to keep around? How long is it really going to be a good thing? So far, that hasn't turned to dust yet. But my sense of it is that we will keep the originals because the technology is such that there might be some way that the original would want to be used to create additional copies of it in the future. But again, that's an issue that we have to continue to look at.
That's great. A work in progress.
Yes.
Okay, I have a couple genealogy-ish type questions. My grandfather was killed by a train in 1905 in Durkee, Oregon. It was the number 6. They stopped the train, took his body on board, and took him to Huntington for an inquest. Would there be some railroad records that are available to the public where they could read more about like a train accident?
Yes. The National Surface Transportation Board has a whole accident area. They do all the investigations, but unfortunately that didn't start until the New Deal also. But if you go to the corporate records of the railroad in charge, there will be, and I think they're mandated to maintain records like that. I know that, again, I'm pretty NP oriented, and I know that there are accident report files at the Minnesota Historical Society that would cover accidents. But if this is either I don't know that town, where that town is in Oregon, whether it's Southern Pacific or Union Pacific.
Union.
Or it is Union. Yeah, there we are.
Yes.
Good. Okay. Well, in the Union Pacific area, Cheyenne, Wyoming has a very fine archive. It's not as easy to get into as some others, but they would undoubtedly be able to dig up the accident report on that, because all of those things end up being being recorded again. So yes.
Okay. And if folks get kind of confused about where to go, can they just go to your website and email the info for
Yeah.
help? Okay, that's great. Another attendee, Michelle, she wrote, my grandma worked on the NPRR all woman section gang working out of Ravensdale from 1942 to 43. Do you have any info on them? And if not, she says she may be able to help.
I will take that help. Send me a note and let's start talking. I'll tell you, Sarita Fredrickson and Ruth X and a lot of the women who became operators during World War II. Unfortunately, the two key people have passed on. We always were talking about it. We need to write up stories. Now, Ruth X did quite a bit of writing on it, but recording that particular period to me is a very fascinating thing. And I would love to talk about that So yes.
There you go, Michelle. I can
Oh,
connect.
absolutely do that. I've written some articles, and there were some articles in the Times and PI back in the day, and I just want to make sure that that short period of time with those real strong 6 women is recorded somewhere.
Great. Yeah, it's actually an interesting thing with the section gang, because that was not an era where everything was done with hydraulics like it is now.
Oh, they were tough.
They actually had to swing a hammer to
Oh,
to succeed.
yes, they did.
I mean, today nobody swings a hammer. They use a boom,
Exactly.
a machine.
Michelle, do you want to ask your other question about your uncle?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And this is actually my grandma's son-in-law, not her son, which is kind of interesting. And I did miss a piece when I typed it. So my uncle began his career for the Northern Pacific back in Minneapolis, St. Paul, probably, right? In the early 40s before he went into World War II. He eventually retired from the Burlington Northern in the early 70s here in Seattle. He had taken a transfer somewhere in the interim. I know you've got the records. I mean, so if he started at the Northern Pacific and he ended up at the Burlington Northern, do you think I can find anything about him?
Oh yeah, definitely. Railroad retirement will track his entire career, because that's the one thing that was.
Then, because my grandma had a railroad social security number, or the equivalent, whatever that's called.
Yeah. No, that's exactly where you want to go. That's online. Contact them. They're in Washington, D.C., and they have good records. And I have heard really good feedback that seems to work. And that's one of the best things, if you can use, if the time frame is correct, that you can use railroad retirement, it's the best place to go.
Slight correction, Gary. The Railroad Retirement Board is based in Chicago. But seriously, as a present, they were originally in Washington, D.C. in 1936, but as a presentation was made to the Short Line Railroad Association middle of 2020, he says that they were kicked out of Washington, D.C. because there was so much war activity going on, so they moved to Chicago.
Thank you, Ed. I always appreciate your exactness of things.
I love it, wherever they are. So I just need for the railroad. Well, so it's called the Railroad Retirement Board?
Yes.
Railroad Retirement Board, or RV, yes.
Okay, great. And I will totally get in touch with you with regard to my grandma, because it's such a great story. I want to make sure that it's there.
It is. It's a great story.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Let's see, we have a question. Do you have information about a photographer, F.J. Haynes, who had a contract with NP from the late 1870s as the railroad moved west?
The Haynes collection is in Helena at the Montana Historical Society. The full collection is there. It's well supported. They are the people. All I have at the archive is books that have used Haynes photos. There's the one that Ed Nolan from Tacoma published, had a nice potpourri of his photos. But really, if you want more detail, get in touch with the Montana Historical Society, and in Helena, and they should be able to help you.
I've done quite a bit of research on F.J. Haynes. I have several of his original photos in my family collection, and some original photos of the Seattle area, which I found quite fascinating.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think that wraps up our questions and therefore our presentation tonight. I want to thank you, Gary, so much for this really informative education about what our local Pacific Northwest Railroad archives in Burien, Washington can provide a whole host of people that are researching railroads.
Yes.
And I want to thank Russ for introducing us, and I want to thank you all for attending. If you all have any questions, feel free to respond to me at the Zoom email link I sent you, and I can try to connect you with the information that you need. Thanks for attending, everyone, and thank you, Gary. Have a wonderful evening.
And thank you.
Thank you, Vicki.